you can start. So Rajarshi Ghose is assistant professor in history at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. His academic interests include medieval and modern South Asia, political and cultural history of Islam, intellectual history, and economic history. He completed his PhD with distinction in 2012 from the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations and the Department of History, University of Chicago. The doctoral dissertation was entitled Politics for Faith, Karamat Ali Jaunpuri and Islamic Revivalist Movements in British India, circa 1800 to 1873. This was brought out as a book, or at least part of it. Rajarshi, you can say a little more about the book if you want when you start. But the title of the book now is Empire of Islam, Karamat Ali Jaunpuri and Politics in British India. This was published by OUP in 2020, that means this year itself. I will not go into a long list of publications and other related sort of experiences. Rajarshi, if you would like to say a few words about your book to begin with, you could. Otherwise, you can begin today's talk.
Thank you very much, Rosikadi, for that warm introduction. And thank you very much to everybody who has taken the trouble to join us, especially from other time zones. For Shauna and Manan, I guess it would be, 4 o'clock in the morning. So thank you very much. The work that I'm going to present is really part of a second project. And it's a long paper, so I'll take around 50 minutes, an hour. So I wouldn't, delay further talking about the book. I've already published parts of it, and I'll refer to it in course of the presentation. So my talk is titled the Decolonization, Abul Kalam Azad, and the Practice of Islamic Law. So the historical, so there are 3 parts to this paper. Right at the beginning, I discussed the histography of decolonization and why we need to look at multiple registers to understand and unravel the complexities of this big historical event. Then I move on to the life of Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, and finally I look at how in his practice as a jurisconsult of Sunni Hanafi law, decolonization, how his practice of Sunni Hanafi law was inflected by decolonization as a formal historical event. So to begin with, I will just review the histography of decolonization insofar it speaks to my own project. The historical process of decolonization that happened in the aftermath of Second World War was characterized by a variety of outcomes which differed across regions and countries. In some places, new flags, new anthems signaled the constitutional abolition of caste discrimination, while elsewhere, racial apathy was further strengthened and legalized. Loss of empire in South Asia led Britain to deepen its presence in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Middle Africa. And it took the former settler colonies such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, almost 3 more decades before they could articulate foreign and military policies independent of Britain. Given its record of a long anti-colonial struggle and successful framing of a democratic constitution, the Indian case was often considered paradigmatic. Historians have rightly pointed out that the Indian campaign for decolonization in around the Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement was more rhetoric than practical support, and that throughout the period, India doggedly opposed the internationalization of insurgent nationalist claims, such as that of Naga self-determination under the leadership of Dr. Fizo, that were emerging within its own territorial boundaries, as Lydia Walker has pointed out, and that governance and politics in post-colonial India was often modulated by institutions that had been put in place by erstwhile colonial regime. However, there is no denial still that decolonization, the formal historical act of decolonization, ushered in a radical shift in the political culture of India with the adoption of a democratic constitution and the principle of universal adult franchise. As Jessica Namakkal has recently argued, the motions of decolonization, from the formation of anti-colonial movements to acts of formal decolonization, changed the meaning of home for many people deeply embedded in colonial geographies and imperial social formations. Karen Bauer has demonstrated the almost unique case of how women galvanized by Pauline Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba's wife, organized and protested in anticipation of the radical change in family structures that decolonization was likely to bring about in post-colonial Congo. Again, as Wazira Yaqub Ali Zamindar has rightly pointed out, such negotiations and reorientations continued well beyond the moment of formal decolonization. There is also much merit in Todd Shepard's and B.D. Hopkins' plea to recognize the distinctiveness of movements of decolonization in 1960s that came in the wake of the post-Second World War globalization, mostly in settler colonies, and were not directly results of anti-colonial struggles. They have especially Australia, New Zealand, and Canada in their mind, as well as warts towards claim for foreign European provenance of decolonization as a concept. Indeed, decolonization was a long and complex historical process and has to be understood in multiple contexts and registers. In this lecture, I am invested to understand how the formal act of decolonization in 1947 impacted the question of spatiality in post-colonial India. Here, Jim Masselos's Decolonized Space, the Reconfiguring of National and Public Space in India is of particular relevance to my project. Indeed, Masselos's remains a useful way to understand the question of spatiality as it was shaped by decolonization in post-colonial India. Masselos identifies as the first area of inquiry the transformation of territorial imaginaries as a result of independence and partition. Second is that of the street side locality, the space inhabited by people in their daily lives before and after independence. And last is the historicization of a spatial past, a continuum of a rethought past invoked by new national identities. Decolonization thus created new national spaces that affected behavior and influenced perceptions in a variety of ways and in different places. The impact of the intersection between the levels, between the configuring, for instance, of street level and national space was variable and often limited, and thus problematizes the effects of the formal act of decolonization. That the street corner continued to retain spatial integrity, a sense of separateness within increasingly wider cities, states, and national circles of organization, much as it had done under the predecessor regime, challenges notions of pervasiveness of decolonization in bringing about encompassing and qualitative structural change. Decolonized space thus became Indian, a point that nationalism, national symbolism inherent in the new evolving national ceremonials unequivocally asserted. But the national values were not only imposed on the new nation space, that space also provided legitimation and reinforcement for the new nation through the accretion of its history and their pervasive continuance into the present. This is basically Walter Mignolo's argument of how the post-colonial reinscribes colonial values, colonial categories into the body of the post-colonial contemporary. So I'm drawing on him here. What was largely rejected was the European and alien past. It was still too close to be absorbed. The nation itself had to be rethought when the process of achieving independence had been completed, given the way in which the freedom struggle's ideas of what would be the national territory had not been fully met. The ceremonials in Delhi and on a smaller scale, the parallel ones in each Indian province and territory aided in the spatial adjustment required, viewed not in terms of ideas and values attaching to space, but to the structural relationships involved in the public space, access to it, and control of it. The government maintained its right of control just as had the British. The maps of power and function still continued to operate in the people's minds through the British character that such templates once presupposed was replaced by Indian determinants. As for accustomed space, once new populations of refugees and migrants had been absorbed, the basic patterns of urban configurations remained much as before, even if some of the specifics had changed. There was now a different Raj, but the Raj there was. Masalus concludes, and I have few quibbles with this proposition. However, as I have stated earlier, the question of spatiality and its entanglement with decolonization has to be understood on multiple registers in order to complicate our understanding of one of the most complex phenomena in modern history. To this end, in this lecture, I will look at how political transformation in the event of decolonization had impacted the practice of Islamic law in South Asia, and how Islamic law addressed the question of spatiality in the aftermath of the formal act of decolonization. As the historian of Islamic law, Wael Hallaq has pointed out that not only do Muslim jurists experience legal change in very concrete terms, but they are also aware of change as a distinct feature of Islamic law. So to repeat, as a historian of Islamic law, Wael Hallaq has pointed out that not only do Muslim jurists experience legal change in very concrete terms, but they are also aware of change as a distinct feature of Islamic law. So this is our cue to enter into a project of historicization of the practice of Islamic law in South Asia. So Hallaq continues, Muslim jurists are actually aware of both the occurrence of and the need for change in the law, and they articulated this awareness through such as the fatwa changes with changing times. So this is a standard maxim amongst Muslim scholars of religion, that the fatwa changes with changing times. Or through the explicit notion that law is subject to modification according to the changing of the times or to the changing conditions of society. So here we will take the formal act of decolonization as an event of historical change. And we will try to see how scholars of Islamic religion reckoned the imperative to change law, to bring about changes in Islamic legal practice in recognition of the formal act of decolonization as a change as a moment of historical change. In the case of modern South Asia, no case of a Muslim jurisconsult, mufti, calling for modification of legal practices in the event of a political change is more famous than that of Shah Abdul Aziz's pronouncement in early 19th century of British India as a domain of war or a Dar al-Harb territory. Issued sometime after the East India Company's occupation of Delhi in 1803, there is no consensus among scholars whether these set of fatwa were meant to have an implicit political import or not. Nevertheless, 20th century historiography on South Asia has often held Shah Abdul Aziz's rather innocuous-looking juristic opinions as the inaugural moment of Muslim religio-legal engagement with colonization and colonialism. Throughout the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, the framework laid down in Abdulaziz's juristic opinions, which were very much within the parameters of standard Hanafi legal practice. Juristic opinions was utilized by innumerable other jurisconsults to make their own judgments about the religio-legal status of British India. Even as they utilized the framework of understanding, the religio-legal judgments and the political choices that the other jurisconsults made were not necessarily in consonance with the original ones that Abdulaziz had arrived at. In fact, even in the wake of decolonization, when the jurisconsults deliberated over the religio-legal status of post-colonial India and Pakistan, many of them chose to approach the problem as essentially a closure to the debate that had begun with Shah Abdul Aziz's juristic opinions. So this is the book, if you can see, which combines the fatwa that were issued post-decolonization to ascertain the ritual status of India and Pakistan as whether they were Dar al-Harb territories or Darul Islam territories. And in both cases, most ulama decided both India and Pakistan were now Darul Islam territories in the wake of decolonization. Some of these questions have been addressed recently in my own Islamic Law and Imperial Space, British India as Domain of Islam circa 1803 and 1870, and in Professor Johannan Friedman's magisterial study published recently, Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb in Modern Indian Muslim Thought. However, while historians have extensively discussed Abdulaziz's fatwa and the debates over them, the ones issued in the wake of decolonization had not been given the scholarly attention that they deserve. In this article, I focus on the career of Abul Kalam Azad. His dates are 1888 and 1958. Religious scholar, literary scholar, leader of the Indian National Congress, and independent India's first Minister of Education as an Islamic jurisconsult. So a jurisconsult in this context is a mufti, a scholar who is entitled to issue fatwa or juristic opinions in light of Islamic law. So I've translated mufti as jurisconsult. And to seek to understand how Azad had judged colonialism in the light of Islamic law and how the historical event of formal decolonization might have impacted Azad's own disciplinary engagement with Islamic legal practice. This exercise, I hope, would not only throw light on the evolutions of Azad's religious thought and the dynamism of Islamic legal practice in post-colonial South Asia, it would also commentary on the contingent beginnings of Indian secularism as a post-colonial political project. So, in interest of time, I've taken out a few sections from this, from the larger article. So there was a section towards the end where I explored the constitution making as a process and how Azad was in fact active in the, putting together the Indian polity as a secular one. That I've taken out for interest of time, and I've also had a section where I discussed at length of the various fatwa that Azad had issued in his long career as a jurisconsult. It's mostly a descriptive section, so I have taken it out. So the next section is called Azad and Indian Nationalism. Azad has been exceptionally lucky to have formidable researchers such as Abdul Kavi Desnavi, Ghulam Rasul Meher, Malik Ram, Abu Salman Shahjahanpuri, Abu Mahfuz Al-Karim Masumi, who have diligently worked towards preserving his writings and invaluable biographical materials. Humayun Kabir, in his part, was instrumental in the publication of Azad's English autobiography, India Wins Freedom, and likewise, Abdul Razak Malihabadi saw the other autobiography in Urdu, Azad Ki Kahani, Khud Azad Ki Zabani, through press with much devotion. Khalik Ahmed Nizami's Masir-e Maulana Abul Kalam Azad is a collection of insightful articles with a particularly interesting commentary on Azad's historiographical praxis, while Kamaristan Khan's edited volume, the Sirat-e-Mustaqim, usefully brings together the theological debates over Azad's commentary on the Quran Sharif, titled the Tarjuma al-Quran. Ziauddin Islahi's book, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, is a useful attempt to systematically study Azad's theology. Finally, the various writings of Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi, more famously known as Ali Mia, who was the rector of the Nadwatul Ulema seminary in Lucknow, his various writings, such as in his Purane-Chirag and elsewhere, evidence the abiding and enduring influence that Azad continued to have on a younger generation of Sunni Muslim scholars of religion, in spite of the relentless hate campaigns that had been waged against him over the decades. Ian Douglas's posthumously published biography of Azad presented the literary, religious, and political careers of its protagonists as intertwined formations, which most contributors to Mushirul Hasan's Islam and Indian Nationalism and Rashiduddin Khan's Abul Kalam Azad also do. Sayyidin Hamid's intervention is also in similar lines. However, it is noteworthy that the Iwani Urdu special issue on Azad focused more on his personal life and his literary accomplishments and not much on his theological writings. Rizwan Kaiser's recent book is not interested in the theological and literary questions so much, but on the other hand, provides a competent study of Azad's career in post-colonial India as a Minister of Education with the Union government. Aisha Jalal, on the other hand, has demonstrated in an essay the imperative to recognize the religious inspiration that shaped Azad's vocation of secular politics, a trait that he himself was never shy of. However, in this considerable scholarship, there was very little discussion on Azad's disciplinary practice of Islamic law and of his lifelong practice as an unattached jurisconsult or mufti of Sunni Islamic law. Because many muftis are often affiliated to Dar al-Ifta, various madrasas and various other religious institutions, Azad was never affiliated mufti. Throughout his long life, Azad issued several fatwa, and scholars like Ghulam Rasul Meher, Malik Ram, Abul Kavi, Desnavi carefully preserved them for long, and finally Abu Salman Shahjahanpuri systematically collected these fatwa in an exceptional volume titled the Ifadat-e-Azad. However, to the best of my knowledge, no one has tried to historically contextualize them, and in that process unravel the evolving trajectory of Azad's Islamic legal thought. In his recent dissertation submitted to Dhaka University, A. Saddam has made adequate use of Azad's writings as a mufti, has not made adequate use of Azad's writing as a mufti, and instead has chosen to draw on his commentary on the Quran, the Tarjuma al-Quran, to tease out his religio-legal opinions. By so doing, he has, in my opinion, glossed over the long history of Azad's engagement with Hanafi Islamic law as a jurisconsult. Because in the commentary that on Quran, Azad is not particularly working from within the parameters of Hanafi Islamic law. He is working in the tradition of tafsir, or commentary on Quran. Whereas in his fatwa, more often than not, he is situated firmly within the field of Hanafi Islamic law. Since Azad's, so the next section is titled The Triumphs and Tribulations of the Imam al-Hind. Since Azad's life is well known to this august audience and has been documented quite well, I will highlight two particular facets which I think are not acknowledged well enough in the existing historiography. In spite of the interventions by historians like Rajat Kantarai, who has documented Azad's involvement as a teenager with the revolutionary underground in colonial Calcutta, there persists an impression that Azad's primary political commitment was to pan-Islamism, and it was only in the wake of the Khilafat movement that it shifted to secular Indian nationalism. There is of course true that Azad spoke the language of pan-Islamism during the early phase, but drawing on John Willis's work, I would like to argue that, like Rashid Rida, for Azad too, the Caliphate as an institution was ultimately less important to Azad than the need to protect the moral boundaries of the community of Muslims and the political independence of the holy cities in face of the power of empire, both of which could be achieved They both determine within the framework of national anti-colonial liberation. So here I'm departing from the reading of Professor Muhammad Qasim Zaman, who has recently written on the debate over the caliphate between Azad and Rashid Rida. So it might be more useful then to consider the caliphate not as a political goal, but rather as part of an Islamic discursive tradition that constituted, in Samida Haj's terms, a framework of inquiry within which Muslims have attempted to amend and redirect Islamic discourses to meet new challenges and conflicts as they materialized in different historical eras. It is in this spirit that Muhammad Qasim Zaman has also uh, uh, described the ulama during the colonial period as the custodians of change and not custodians of traditions. That is, the debate over the caliphate carried such great resonance in part because it drew on arguments, hermeneutics, modes of scholarship, and authoritative texts which suggested continuity with the tradition of Islamic scholarship while addressing the modern problems of empire, nationalism, and new forms of political subjectivity. However, I would now like to present some more evidence that pan-Islamism notwithstanding, Azad's primary political commitment had always been to Indian secular nationalism. Thus, in the Lisan-ul-Sidh journal, which he edited in Volume 1, Issue 2, published on 20th January 1904, when the barely 16-year-old editor commented on Alfred Nandi's article, The Troubles of the National Congress, published the very same year in the journal East and West. Azad here shared Nandi's anguish that the Indian National Congress was not reaching out to non-Hindu communities, and by not doing so, it was ending up being non-representative of the Indian people. Both Nandi, a Bengali Christian nationalist, and Azad wanted the Congress to mend its way and work towards becoming a more inclusivist and a more representative organization. Azad in fact said that by not reaching out to the non-Hindu communities, the Congress was ending up in a predicament that Sir Syed Ahmed Khan had anticipated long back. Yet both Nandi and Azad had hope that the Congress would correct its course and evolve soon into a more inclusivist organization. It is also clear from the other reports published in the same journal in the same year of the Lisan-ul-Sidh that Azad, in spite of his misgivings, remained hopeful of the Congress's capacity to forge a secular nationalist constituency in colonial India. Thus, even in 1904, as a young 16-year-old, Azad resolutely stood for secular Indian nationalism, and his view, it was the Indian National Congress that was failing its mandate. So there was nothing wrong with its mandate, but the Congress was failing that mandate. Also, it is noteworthy here that Azad did not foreground his Islamic belief as the guiding principle
I'm sorry, Rajarshi. Hello, Rajarshi. The internet seems to have gone on the blink for a little while. Hello, Rajarshi, can you hear me? Okay, so should I make an announcement? Okay, so let me just make an announcement. Okay, good. Okay. So just to say to the listeners, we're sorry about this, but there seems to be a problem with the internet at the center. Rajarshi is basically presenting from the center, and they said on the phone right now that they're trying to reconnect. Somebody seems to have switched the server off. We are not fully functional yet, so there might have been some miscommunication. Just give it a little bit of time and we should be back soon, I hope. I hope everybody's got that message. I'll type it out as well. Can you hear me? Can someone respond?
Yeah. This is Maidul Islam here. Yes.
Okay, Maidul. Where are you? I don't see you. Anyway.
Video off.
Okay, your video is off. Okay, that's fine then. So basically we're waiting and I'll just type a message as well. Connection এসছে দেবজ্যোতি? আমাকে কি করতে হবে বলো? আমাকে কিছু করতে হবে? আমরা তো সবাই ওয়েট করছি। অ্যালাউ মানে কাকে অ্যালাউ? সবাই তো অলরেডি আছে এখানে। না, অ্যাডমিট কে? রাজস্বীকে? আচ্ছা, রাজস্বীকে বলো তাহলে ওর ইয়েটা পেলেই, রিকোয়েস্টটা পেলেই আমি ওকে অ্যাডমিট করে দিচ্ছি। কানেকশন এসছে? Okay, so Rajarshi, I got the request. There, I can see you now. Okay, Rajarshi, welcome back. What is a center talk without a technical glitch? So we've had one of those now. I hope we don't have any more. Please go ahead. Continue. Just if you want, you can go back a little bit and just start again from a few sentences. back, because it took us a while to realize that it's your connection, not ours, that had gone. Can you hear me? Rajarshi? Can you hear me? Oh, wait a minute, you're muted. Yeah. Okay, can you hear me now?
Mute me.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Sorry for the glitch. Somebody had switched off the internet here. So I'm sorry.
Yes, I was just saying that we have finally sort of had a technical glitch.
Yeah.
We have to have that now. Please, just if you can rewind a little bit, just a tiny bit.
Yeah. So we were discussing how when Azad was just a 16-year-old, while commenting on Alfred Nandi's article, how he echoed Alfred Nandi's concern that the Congress must must reach out to non-Muslim communities and must evolve into a more pluralistic and a more inclusivist organization. And while he was making this plea in this particular, this is Azad's inaugural comment on politics. This is Azad's inaugural comment not only on South Asian politics, but on politics at large. And it is interesting that in this short piece, he's echoing the sentiments of a Bengali Christian nationalist and asking the Congress to evolve into a more pluralistic organization. And he's not foregrounding his own Islamic belief as the undergirding principle of this move towards a pluralistic politics. So, having said that, since much of this paper is about Azad's practice as an Islamic jurisconsult, it is imperative to flag one more issue about his changing fortune as a scholar of religion. Broadly speaking, and here I'm condensing a lot of history into a couple of sentences, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Azad established his reputation as a peerless scholar of religion and had big people such as Shibli Numani themselves having his back. However, once a visible constituency of Indian Muslims galvanized against the Indian National Congress, primarily under the leadership of the All India Muslim League, Azad's standing as a scholar of religion and a jurisconsult also took a hit. And he was routinely assailed in both the English language as well as Bangla language and Urdu language public sphere. Let us consider just one example. On the 29th of February 1939, so we are almost getting into the decade of partition, and on 29th February 1939, Zafar Ali Khan, his dates are 1873 and 1956, the editor of the Urdu language daily newspaper Zamindar and a supporter of the All India Muslim League, happened to be in Sarai Mir, a small town in eastern United Provinces. It appears it's quite close to Azamgarh, and it is home to the Madrasatul Islam, a very important theological school, which is now represented by Javed Ahmed Hamidi in Pakistan, is located there. So the Islahi movement started from Sarai Mir. So it appears that Khan was rather impressed with the work being done there by 2 centers of Islamic learning, namely the Madrasa al-Islam and the Baitul Ulum, and was inspired enough to compose a short poem titled Sarai Mir, which went as follows. The translation is mine. It is spring. The season of the autumn is over. The clouds of God's mercy have rained in torrents again and again. Come to the garden to listen to the nightingale's song. Leave the desolate place of screeching owls. I wave the flag of reform, as in Islam. Remember, Madrasatul Islam. So I wave the flag of reform in Sarai Mir and also serve the house of learning, which is Baitul Ulum. So he's referencing that both the madrasas in the poem. However, towards the end of the poem, he turned towards his audience, possibly the residents of that small town, and extolled them. If you want to raise Abraham's banner, renounce at once all customs of the Magians. If you want to turn the spinning wheel, which is the charkha, do so with the hand of judgeship, Dast-e-Qaza, and destroy the pretenses of the hypocrites of India, the Nifaq-e-Hind. Ask him why he forgot the holy sanctuary, the Kaaba Sharif. Once Abul Kalam was back from his trip to Wardha. Wardha is where Gandhi was staying, Wardha Ashram, right? Where the Wardha educational experiment was also happening. So the poem goes, it is spring, the season of autumn is over, the clouds of God's mercy have rained in torrents again and again. Come to the garden to listen to the nightingale's song. Leave the desolate space to the screeching owls. I waved the flag of reform in Sarai Mir and also serve the house of learning. If you want to raise Abraham's banner, renounce at once all customs of the Magians. If you want to turn the spinning wheel, the charkha, do so with the hand of judgeship, the Dast-e-Qaza, and destroy the pretenses of the hypocrites, the Nifaq-e-Hind. Ask him why he forgot the holy sanctuary once Abul Kalam was back from his trip to Wardha. It is quite unexceptional that the poem ended with a swipe at Abul Kalam Azad. In fact, it was commonplace then in Muslim League circles to portray Azad's affiliation to Gandhian nationalism and the Indian National Congress as religious heresy. It has been argued that the polemics in wake of the publication of the first volume of his Tarjuma al-Quran in 1931 were mostly driven politically. Here I'm drawing on the contemporary reviews and writings which have been compiled in the volume edited by Kamaristan Khan titled The Sirat-e Mustaqim. Zafar Ali Khan himself had written on 23rd October 1937 another acerbic poem where he claimed that in Azad's scheme of things, Islam would end up with just slavery of unbelief, gulami kufr ki, in its share, and tacitly referred to the Congress leader as a misguided Muslim who was embarrassed of his own religion. In 1938, popular opinion in Calcutta was mobilized against Azad, and he was forced to give up his position as the leader or the imam of the Eid prayers held in the city Maidan. Thus, the heresiographical charge in Sarai Mir is not surprising in itself. But the mode that Khan adopts is significant. He appropriates the spinning wheel, a well-known symbol of Gandhian politics, to enable his readers to act as judges and pass judgments on hypocrites like Azad. Khan's invocation of the jurisprudential imperative towards the end, his invitation to his readers to turn the spinning wheel with the hand of judgeship, Dast-e-Qaza, underlines the importance of Islamic law in his political imagination. It was an orientation and characteristic that Azad shared with his detractor. And it is also indicative that Khan wanted to hit Azad where he knew it would hurt most. So in Azad ki kahani, now I'll briefly discuss Azad's career as a mufti. Azad's ki kahani, Azad ki zubani, his reminiscences narrated to and edited by Abdul Marihabadi. Azad recollected how during his homeschooling in the Nizami curriculum, his father, Khairuddin, had encouraged him to focus on Arabic grammar, logic, rational disciplines, and Islamic jurisprudence. And throughout his life, Azad functioned as an unattached Islamic jurisconsult, diligently attended to his ifta or fatwa issuing responsibilities, and was approached for consultation, futwe, on legal questions by organizations and individuals from across South Asia. In June 1921, in the thick of the Khilafat non-cooperation movement, Azad publicly endorsed the efforts of the scholars of religion who had urged Muslims to shun the colonial judiciary and resort to privately constituted Sharia courts and strive towards a form of jurisprudential apartheid in British India. From that moment then, Azad's practice as an independent jurisconsult and a scholar of Islamic jurisprudence who operated outside the institutional parameters of colonial judiciary became a component of his anti-colonial politics. So in this, I'll skip a few sections, and so in this lecture, because I'm well over time, I think in this essay I explore aspects of Azad's career as a jurisconsult and attempt to understand how political change, especially the politics of decolonization, impacted his disciplinary practice of Islamic law. I focus on two juristic rulings from a few hundreds, one from 22nd April 1921 and the other from 1954. So 1921 and 1954, which Azad had issued to arbitrate in intra-communal disputes arising over the management of two mosques, the Nakhoda Mosque in Calcutta and the Ahle Hadith Masjid of Maler Kotra in the Sanghu district of Punjab, respectively. And both of these fatwas do not find place in Abu Salman Shahjahanpuri's collection, so I have used the early printed versions of these fatwas. In the elaborate Nakhoda Masjid ruling, Azad echoed the position that he had already voiced in his Khutbat-e-Siyasi or Masajid-e-Islamia 1913 and ruled that all mosques were by definition political spaces and that it was religiously permissible to arrange political. He uses political in the original fatwa itself. The Khutbat-e-Siyasiya or the Masajid-e-Islamia, political and ghair-political, non-political assemblies in them, and that since the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad, mosques had functioned as the parliament of Muslims, Musalmanon ke parliament. So in the Khutbat-e-Siyasiya or Masajid-e-Islamia, Azad ruled in 1913 that all mosques were by definition political spaces and it was religiously permissible to arrange political and non-political assemblies in them, and that since the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad, mosques had functioned as the parliament of Muslims. However, in his short ruling from 1954, titled Imam al-Hind Maulana Abul Kalam Azad ka Faisla or Maler Kotla ka Niza. Niza is conflict. Azad declared in unequivocal terms that it was imperative that the imam or the prayer leader of a mosque remain unaffiliated to and stayed clear of all political and religious movements of the times. So in the 1954 fatwa, Azad ruled that it was imperative, it was religiously the religious norm demanded that the imam or the prayer leader of a mosque remain unaffiliated to and stayed clear of all political and religious movements of the times. According to Azad, it was well within the rights of a person to join any religious or political movement. However, a mosque could not be turned into a hub of propaganda for any particular movement, and nothing should be preached in a mosque other than the teachings of the Quran and the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. In my view, there are two ways to understand the considerations that could have brought about a radical disjuncture between Azad's position in 1921 and 1954 respectively. The circumstances that might have radically altered his perception of a mosque being an intrinsically political space. Was Azad an insincere jurisconsult whose practice of Islamic law was driven by his own political ambitions? Is the radical disjuncture an instance of his opportunist engagement with the Sharia? Or was it the internal logic of Islamic jurisprudence itself that had effected this change in Azad's position, and whereas he had himself remained consistent in terms of his disciplinary practice? Is it the very dynamism of Islamic jurisprudence that enabled Azad to articulate two contradictory positions in 1921 and in 1954? So to briefly cover the Calcutta Fatwa, have I run out of time?
Rajarshi, we are anyway, we were interrupted and there was, we've lost time. So I don't have an exact measure of time left. Just
to wrap up,
yeah, take it as you feel like. I mean, don't go on for another hour, but yeah.
Azad's ruling on matters related to the Nakoda Masjid of Calcutta, the Faisla titled in its published version, the Faisla-e Muqaddama-e Jama Masjid-e Calcutta, was first published by the custodians of the mosque in 1921 itself. The Nakoda Masjid, which remains Calcutta's most capacious mosque, came into being in around 1856. And I'll skip a bit here, it was basically a communitarian initiative of the Kutchi Memon mercantile diaspora in Calcutta that was instrumental in the foundation of the mosque. Even though it had an earlier history, there were two mosques in the site before that, and the two properties were amalgamated, and then the Kutchi Memon diaspora built this bigger one. And interestingly, Azad's father, who was a Sufi Pir, had enormous leverage over, even though they were themselves not Kutchi Memons, but Azad's father had many important disciples from the Kutchi Memon mercantile diaspora. So much so that Azad's family used the Kutchi Memon community graveyard in Maniktola as their family graveyard. His father, his wife, his son, his brother are all interned in the Kutchi Memon graveyard. So so it was. So one of the core questions. So the Memons as a community made significant financial contributions, possibly the largest, towards building the new big mosque, and consequently came to dominate the mosque committee for good. This overlap of the Memon caste organization, such as the Memon Community Jamaat Trust and the Memon Khairat Fund, and the management community of the new mosque had significant consequences for the future. The mosque came to be identified as a community initiative, as I've just said, of the Kutchi Memons, and consequently was known in popular parlance as the Nakhoda Masjid. Muhammad Zakariya, we still have Zakariya Street named after him, the leading member of the Kutchi Memon community, emerged as such a towering presence in the affairs of the Nakhoda Masjid that the new mosque also came to be known as the Zakariya Masjid. Upon the death of Muhammad Zakariya in 1873, his mantle, both in the Memon community affairs and the mosque community, was inherited by his son Nur Muhammad. After a couple of decades, Nur Muhammad was at loggerheads with some of the other leaders of the Kutchi Memon community, and in 1907, a legal case was filed in the High Court at Calcutta. Nur Muhammad passed away in 1915, and another member of Haji Muhammad Zakariya's clan inherited his positions. In 1918, there began a conflict between the custodians of the Nakhoda Masjid and the gentleman who had been appointed by them as the Imam of the prayer leader of the mosque. And in circa 1919-20, another legal case was started in the High Court. As the Sufi Sheikh, Azad's father, Maulana Khairuddin, had significant leverage over a number of Kutchi Memon merchants in Calcutta. Even though it is noteworthy that Khairuddin, Azad's older brother, Ghulam Yasin, and Azad's wives are all buried in the Kutchi Memon graveyard in the Maniktola neighborhood of Calcutta. After Azad returned to Calcutta from his internment in Ranchi, this is where he wrote up his brilliant book, the Tazkira. Both the conflicting groups realized that it had been wrong on their part to take a dispute over a matter related to an Islamic endowment, an institution ideally governed by Islamic law, to a non-Muslim court, Gair-Muslim Adalat. Thus, the two groups withdrew the matter from High Court and appointed Azad as the sole arbitrator of the case, so that he could issue in the matter a ruling which was consistent with the Sharia. One of the core questions that underlay the conflict over the Nakhoda Masjid was whether the custodians of a mosque had the right to sack an imam or a prayer leader who was popular and revered amongst the general Muslim population. Consequently, in his ruling of 1921, Azad dwelt at length on the religio-political norms governing the position of the imam of a mosque. Azad regretted the fact that imamat was no longer the exalted institution that the Sharia stipulated it to be. The salaried imamat, azir or tankadar imam, somebody who is paid to be an imam. So in the older times, the Caliph of Islam would himself perform the imamat during prayers, and but with times you started having professional imams, tankada, salaried imams. Of 20th century British India did not quite approximate the grand position envisioned by Islamic law. Azad then meticulously detailed the moral characteristics that the Sharia expected a mosque prayer leader to embody. Thus, according to him, the mosque imamat was meant to be a sacred and exalted office, muqaddas or Mohtaram Mansab, an embodiment of knowledge and religious practice. In fact, Azad went on to the extent of claiming that in true and subtle senses, mosque imamat approximated the rank of communal leadership, Jamati Peshwai amongst the Muslims. In earlier times, only the Muslims who had distinguished themselves for their pious fear, knowledge and sincerity of religious practice qualified for the exalted rank of this communal leadership. According to the Maulana, one of the reasons that had triggered this devaluation of Imamat in South Asia was the termination of Islamic rule in the subcontinent. After all, the conditions that the Sharia had laid down for the choice and appointment for the Imam of the mosque were no longer applicable to South Asia, Hindustan in the fatwa, since the Islamic government, Islamic Hukumat, had ended in the subcontinent. Azad then opined that practice of Islam, since Islamic government had ended in the subcontinent, the practice of jurisprudential the practice of Islamic law too had to change with the transformation of political regimes, and jurisprudential practices had to evolve in tandem with political change. Implicitly, what Azad claimed was that an Islamic jurisconsult in British India had to recognize that South Asia was no longer a domain of Islam or a Dar al-Islam. So here he is going back to the fatwa issued by Shah Abdul Aziz in sometime around 1803. That British India had ceased to be a Dar al-Islam and British India was in fact a Dar al-Harb. The jurisconsult had to acknowledge that British India was a domain of war, a dominion where Islamic regulations were not in force, and it was thus mandatory for a Muslim to migrate from the territory. In this particular decade, the religio-juridical status of British India was a question that Azad had repeatedly deliberated on. In his ruling of May 1920 on the question of migration or hijrat from British India, Azad had tacitly termed British India to be a domain of war. So I'm quoting Azad. After examining all the reasons embodied in the Sharia, contemporary events, interests of the Muslims, and expedient counsels, I feel completely satisfied in my perception that for Muslims of India, there is no Shari alternative but to go on hijrat. In principle, although Azad worked within the same legal tradition as Shah Abdul Aziz, which is the Hanafi Islamic law, their political registers, imaginaries, and vocabularies were profoundly unalike. For historical reasons, the intrinsic criterion that characterized Azad's vision of a moral government was not shared by Abdul Aziz. Thus, they both considered British India to be a domain of war for very different reasons. Whereas Shah Abdul Aziz's principal reason was that the Imam al-Muslimin or the Mughal emperor held no power in early 19th century Delhi, that the Christians were in power in the entire stretch of the country from Delhi to Calcutta, and the promulgations of unbelief or kufr were followed in matters of secular administrations. Azad's ruling was shaped by the critique of the promiscuous entanglement of liberalism and empire that the Maulana had started articulating at this juncture of his life. So here I refer to editorials from the Al-Hilal as well as his submission to the Alipur court trial. And so
Rajarshi, can you hear me?
I'll finish off now.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. It's
So the entanglement of liberalism and empire became his principal plank, political plank, to declare British India to be a immoral regime, from which Muslims are religiously required to migrate from. So I will just read the small section on in 1954, all of a sudden, the Ahl Hadith movement, I'll finish in 5 minutes. In 1954, all of a sudden, the Ahl Hadith movement in Punjab found itself in the thick of an intense internecine conflict. The movement's mosque in Malerkotra village of Sangur district of the Indian province of Punjab had become a bone of contention between two factions. One faction of the Anjuman-e-Ahl Hadith filed a case in the High Court of Punjab, but the judge referred the matter to Maulana Azad. The issue at stake was the question of mosque imamat again. An Ahl Hadith scholar of religion from Uttar Pradesh, Muhammad Amin Mubarakpuri, had been appointed as the Imam and Khatib of the Malerkotra Mosque. Maulana Mubarakpuri had been on the job for 2 years when some other members of the Anjuman-e-Ahl Hadith found out that he was a member of the Jamaat-e-Islami, the movement founded by Abul Ala Maududi, and was committed to Abul Ala Maududi's ideology. The aggrieved members claimed that Maulana Mubarakpuri was turning the Malerkotra Mosque into a hub for Jamaat-Islami propaganda and refused to pay behind him. One Maulana Abdullah was appointed to run parallel sessions of communal prayers on Fridays in the same mosque. In his ruling on the question, Azad opined that Maulana Mubarakpuri should not be allowed to continue in his office. In fact, anybody who had affiliations to any political movement, and not just the Jamaat-e-Islami, but any political movement, should not be allowed to hold office of a mosque imam. A person who had no connections with the political and religious movements of his times was best suited for the position of an imam. By 1954, Azad had returned to his initial position where he thought the mosque imam as a political vocation and the mosque as normatively a political space. According to the Maulana, it was well within the rights of a person to join any religious or political movement that had been happening in the country, but it was reprehensible that a mosque be turned into a hub of political propaganda. Nothing should be preached in the mosque, Azad said, other than the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. So to briefly conclude, I would argue that this shift in Azad's perception of a mosque to be normatively a political space to Azad's opinion that the mosque as a matter of principle was a political space happened because of the shift because of the political change that the formal act of decolonization had brought in place. Because with political change, as I said right at the beginning, with political change, the practice of Islamic law changes. So with decolonization, as far as Azad was concerned, a new a new politically just regime was in place in India. And a lot of ulama, most of the ulama, concurred with Azad on this question. And since a new morally just, politically just regime was in place in India, the mosque transformed into a place where no political propaganda, political agitations could be allowed to happen. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rajarshi, for a wonderful talk. I know that there are many historians among us over here, I'm sure, waiting to ask a question. So it is possible to actually type in your question as well in the chat if you would prefer that. Otherwise, if you could, you see, now the problem is I am not seeing everybody on my screen at the same time. So if anybody has a question and wishes to ask it, if you could just unmute yourself. Are you all, do I need to unmute everybody or is it?
I think you need to unmute everybody.
Just give me a minute.
No, I think, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Prachi. Yeah, I can hear you, Prachi. Oh, there's Parthuda. No, that's fine then. I'm not doing anything then.
Let's see how.
Parthuda has...
everyone can individually unmute. Everyone can unmute individually and ask, I suppose.
Yeah, great. That would be great because otherwise sometimes background noise interferes with the entire thing. So when you need to ask a question, just unmute and come onto the screen. I'll see you anyway. So I'll start with Parthuda because that's the first hand I saw up, and then Prachi as well.
I'll just take...
Rosindadi, I have typed a question in the chat box.
Okay, Karthik. Rajarshi, can you see the chat box as well?
I will, yeah.
Okay. So Karthik has a question in the chat box. So
Take the questions together.
do you want to collect them?
Yeah.
Would you rather collect the questions, Rajarshi?
Yeah, that would help.
Okay, so we'll start with Parthuda.
Honestly, I'm a little puzzled by the way you place these two fatwas by Azad, one from 21 and the other from 56, because your argument seems to be that Azad claimed that in 21 the mosque would legitimately be a political space because it was Darul Harb. India was Darul Harb, and whereas in 56 it was no longer Darul Harb, and therefore the mosque should not be a political space. But I thought you also said that Azad claimed that the mosque was both a political as well as a non-political space all the way back from the time of the Prophet. Now, so his argument couldn't be as simple as that. There must be something else to this argument.
So, Parthuda, if I have got you right, so you're saying that there, apart from the question of regime change, there should be something more to this argument.
Okay, Prachi, you're next. Okay, Prachi doesn't, Prachi just typed in that she doesn't have a question right now. Sorry, I thought you'd raised your hand, Prachi. So Karthik has a question in the chat. Does it make sense to call Azad a secularist? Or with the benefit of hindsight, is it more apt to call him a post-secularist? Any more questions? Because Rajarshi wants to collect a few. So is there anybody I'm not seeing? Please alert me to, Justin Jones has a question. I can see a hand up there. Yeah, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, hi Rajarshi. Nice to see you. Thanks for the talk. Can I just ask very generally about Abul Kalam Azad's other fatwa and kind of particularly what issues are being discussed? So you focused very much on this this theme of the mosque and kind of mosque governance and how that ties into the question of the political. But yeah, when one reads about fatwa from this era, one particularly reads about changes in like ibadat and practice of worship. There's a lot, of course, about things like personal law and the transitions happening there around about the time of independence. And so can you just give an overview of what he actually writes about and whether he is particularly interested in these questions of kind of social relations and political governance, or whether he is looking at a lot of the stuff of many of the other ulama?
I think I'll just respond to these three first and then take another set of questions.
Sure.
Okay, so to respond to Justin's question first, see, Azad was writing on, as far as his fatwas are concerned, he was writing on all kinds of issues. And I have a descriptive section in the paper. So he was, the usual, the ubiquitous question of whether it is halal to take bank interest, to invest in insurance policies, a lot of questions about khula, marital relationships, a lot of questions about what kind of food to consume. But interestingly, he has, a very this is something that Ghulam Rasul Meher notes somewhere, and I have been able to find that fatwa from the back numbers of the Zamindar. Is his fatwa on the Ahmadiyas. If you will remember his autobiography, Azad Ki Kahani Khud Azad Ke Zabani, he is quite transparent about the fact that he had gone to Qadian and had prayed with Ghulam Ahmed Qadiani in communal prayers, right? And he never resigned that position. He never regretted having prayed with them. This is a fatwa that he gave on the Ahmadiyas in the Zamindar, which was issued elsewhere, but the Zamindar reprinted it. That, I think, is one of the very theologically, from the theological point of view, from the intellectual point of view, and this is something that Ali Usman Qasmi's book does not address, but it has its merits, of course. But there's also a longer history of people speaking up for the Ahmadiyas before the terms of the debates get so solidified in the post-colonial period. So Azad's that fatwa is very interesting. The most famous fatwa is, of course, the fatwa of the Hijra, which so that in wake of the Khilafat agitation, Azad ruled that it was, since the British had attacked the Ottoman Caliph, it was no longer possible for Muslims, religiously permissible for Muslims to live in India, and they had to perform hijrat. And a few thousand people actually did perform hijrat, which you can read about in Muhammad Naim Qureshi's book on the Khilafat movement. But the bulk of them are about marital relationships, are about property disputes, are about insurance policies, are about financial innovations, are about humdrum everyday life. Some person mistakenly lying next to his mother-in-law, and whether the marriage stands dissolved or not. Those kind of issues that you would commonly come across in fatwa collections from those periods. And of course, as you pointed out, a lot on the ibadat, especially in relation to the Ahl-e Hadith sect. Because Azad's father was virulently anti-Ahl-e Hadith, and he came to regret his father's anti-Ahl-e Hadith activities later in his life, from his teenage onwards, and he had considerable affection, like people like Ghulam Rasul Meher and others who were his closest associates belonged to the Ahl Hadith sect. Even though he himself, as far as his legal practice is concerned, operated within the parameters of Hanafi law always, without it. But he was, in some of his fatwa, you see he's trying to bring about rapprochements between the Ahl Hadith and the Hanafis. And so, and this would have particular implications on how you pray. You know, like saying the Ameen aloud, or where to hold your hands while offering your prayers, so on and so forth. Yeah. And is that good, Justin?
Thanks. Thank you.
Secularist or post-secularist? Karthik, I would rather want to, as I see Azad as a phenomenon, Azad's secular, if you have to look at Azad in terms of his political thought, in terms of his religious thought, Azad always say that the primary identity that I perform is that of a Muslim, that of a Sunni Muslim. The rest of my activities are basically functions of my belief in Islam. So, and Azad would argue that secularism was derivative of Islamic tradition. But does that, Karthik, but that doesn't necessarily, so his commitment to secularism, as I pointed out in the paper, has been almost lifelong. He was 16-year-old when he first commented on Indian politics, and it was for a plea for a more pluralist and cross-sectarian political mobilization. So his commitment was lifelong, but that commitment was not itself, so it was derived from his Islamic identity, from his Islamic practice. This is how he would put it. And if you will look into his papers after 1947, when he's talking about socialism, so he's quite, as far as it is apparent, he's quite wedded to socialism as Nehru is envisioning it, if I may say so. But even then, he does not resign the fact that again and again he's saying that my politics in its entirety is derived from Islamic tradition. So it is not really a post-secularist position. Say that secularism is not his primary mode of political engagement. It is a derivative mode of political engagement. The primary mode is, of course, remains Islamic tradition. So even when he is doing Gandhian nationalism or Nehruvian post-colonial developmentalist statecraft, it is, theoretically speaking, it is all derived from his belief in Islam and its political tradition. This is a person who's saying that, the French Revolution itself is perfectly consistent with the Islamic tradition. And he's saying that in way back in 1920, right? So, because Islam stood for anti-absolutism, Islam was bringing down the Persian Empire, Islam was bringing down the Byzantine Empire. So basically Islam is an anti-absolutist political force, just as the French Revolution is. And he's explicitly making these comparisons in 1921. So that will be it. So Parthuda. Parthuda, this is a question that I have not been really able to resolve. But as I pointed out very briefly in my paper itself, that it could be that Azad was a very canny man and he was an insincere practitioner of the Sharia. A lot of people in Pakistan actually believe that, Even if you now hang out with older people, they will tell you about gossips about how Azad would not pray routinely, that he would be consuming alcohol, having out-of-wedlock relationships, so on and so forth. So that is there. One way to look at it is that he was an insincere practitioner of the Sharia, and this was, his work as a mufti was just a facade. But what I want to trying to understand is the discipline. I'm not interested in Azad's engagement with Islamic law. I'm interested in Azad's disciplinary engagement with Islamic law. So when I have to think through, so if I have to think about the discipline, his disciplinary engagement with Islamic law, so then I have to run run my arguments through the logic of Islamic law itself. How? Following the logic of the Sharia, because see, in the Sharia there is no provision that you can be insincere in your practice as a mufti. Right, that is not a valid option in the Sharia. That is not a disciplinary option in the Sharia. So if you have to engage, if you have to follow the logic of the Sharia itself, logic of the Hanafi fiqh itself, then you will have to think about questions that would be admissible within the practice of Islamic law. Which is why I think it is I have thought about this problem for quite some time. Zafar Ali Khan would have point blank told us he was an insincere man, why even consider him to be a mufti? He was a bad guy who was always shifty, and his detractors have always said that. So, which is why if you have to run the logic of Islamic law, run the logic of the Sharia, I think this is the most possible reason that one can come up with. But I would like to hear more from you, Parthuda, on this particular question. What do you think, what else could have been the reason?
Is Parthuda there? I can't see.
Yeah, it's there.
Honestly, look, I am not familiar with all the details of. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with all the details of Azad's own thinking because unless one reads Urdu, it's impossible to follow the Azad in his detail his entire career because so little has been translated to English. But there could be a completely different and fairly obvious answer, which is that in the space of 30 years, Azad actually revised and changed his view on the relationship between the political and the non-political, even within the parameters of Islamic jurisprudential thinking. It's perfectly possible that he did this. I don't know whether he explains this or anything, because it's a space of some 30 plus years. But I think you're trying to assume that in fact his fundamentals remain the same, and it's within that you're trying to find out some kind of consistency between these two apparently very, very opposed judgments. So this is, and I don't know which of these two positions would be correct, because as I said, I don't know the details of the evolution of Azad's thinking on the question of relation between the political and the non-political.
But the problem is that towards in the later half of his life, even though he was not commenting so much on the relationship between politics and religion, but there is no evidence, as far as I know, that he ever revised his opinion on the necessary relationship between Islam and politics, which is, of course, there are many thinkers working within the framework of the Islamic tradition who would consider politics not necessarily in relationship with Islam, right? They would talk about a private practice of religion, which is quite a plausible case in case of Azad, possibly. But there is, I at least have never come across a piece of evidence where Azad is talking about private practice of religion. But we could, of course, this is a very, very valid speculation, that maybe he along with many other scholars had started thinking in terms of a private practice of religion, but nobody, Ghulam Rasul Meher, Abdul Qavi Desnavi, Abu Salman Shahjahanpuri, people who knew him very well and personally say that.
Rajarshi, it need not be a general question of the relationship between the religious and the political. It could be a much more specific question about the space of the mosque and whether or not political assemblies were permissible within the space of the mosque. And so I don't know whether in this, he was very clear that in 1921 when he's saying this, that yes, the mosque is a place of a political assembly. Whether he changes that view later on in the 50s. So this, I don't know what
See, in 1921, he's going as far as saying that the mosque is the parliament of the Muslims.
And
So,
how the Khilafat movement was actually the campaigns. The mosques were a very, very central place for this. We all know this. Now, whether he believes that this condition should change, given the fact that there is now a constitution and everything else,
yeah.
I don't know what the answer is.
That is exactly what I was hinting at. Now that there is a constitution and an universal adult franchise and a parliament elected through universal adult franchise, probably the seat of the location of the parliament the location of legislations could shift elsewhere. But your other point about whether he was thinking of Islam as a matter of private practice is something we don't have any evidence. I've looked for this very, very closely, but there is no evidence for this.
No, I wasn't actually thinking of the relation between private and public. I don't think that is something that could have entered Azad's thinking at all. Anyway, let's move on to other questions.
Yeah.
There are two other hands up. I can see that Shauna Rodriguez and Mohammed Anisur Rahman both have a small sign, I think, saying that they want to ask a question.
Shauna needs to unmute herself.
Oh, yeah, Shauna needs to unmute herself. Yes.
She has, yeah.
Rosinka, Manubidi, I also have a question.
Where are you? Who's this?
Manubidi.
Oh, Manubidi. Okay, good. So after Mohammed Anisur Rahman, then Rajarshi will take the three together. Sorry, Manubidi, I didn't see. Where are you?
I am invisible because my connection is unstable.
Right, but we can hear you, so that's fine. So, Shauna, please start, and we'll take these three.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be part of a center talk, just like Manan. And thank you so much for this talk, Rajarshi, if I can call you that. I was quite fascinated by your use of Halak's argument to justify Azad's change in his position, because I feel that in many ways, Azad has been criticized so much for this, so-called pragmatic politics of his. And so the sort of internal logic of Sharia and making, an Islamic, bringing out fatwas in the way in which Halak talks about sort of changes things so much. But I was wondering, what thinking of decolonization through the angle of Islamic law does for a figure like Azad, as opposed to something like tafsir, because something like because of two reasons. One, because his tarjuma was so widely read, and because of the argument that you're making initially that in Lisanul Siddiq, he's not speaking just for Muslims alone, but he's allying with other non-Muslims to demand inclusion within the nationalist movement. So in some sense,
Hindus.
Sorry?
On Hindus in the nationalist movement.
Yeah, I mean, of course, he wants to join the Hindus in the nationalist movement, but the sort of alliance that you were talking about with this Christian nationalist, I'm forgetting his name right now.
Alfred
Yeah.
Alfred
Yeah. And so, I was wondering whether the argument, because this sort of pluralist argument is so important for Azad, you know, why contain the argument of decolonization to Islamic law as opposed to something like tafsir, you know? What is the space for combining the two, for example? So that's my first question. I have another question. Can I ask one more?
Yeah, sure, please.
Thank you. So my second question is the sort of, you know, what you were talking about, his interaction with the LA Hippies, his interaction with the Skachi Memon, you know, mosque, and the, you know, the fatwa that he gives that Indian Muslims should do hijrat and go to Afghanistan. And there's a way in which the kind of interaction he has with a very diverse Muslim world, as opposed to a lot of people who critiqued him that, like you said, they were usually, you know, they were usually affiliated with the school of thought. This kind of, you know, interaction across the board that he not just did, but he commanded. What does that do for him as a political figure? You know, not just of decolonization, a political figure of decolonization. Yeah. Sorry, I have these very big questions, but yeah.
So as a political figure, so you're saying that he was engaging all his life with diverse constituencies, and what then, and how does that make him a different kind of a political figure? Or sorry, I couldn't get your last question.
I'm asking what it does to him as a decolonizing figure, as a figure who can bring in different kinds of, you know, different kinds of Islamic communities into a sort of larger thought on decolonization.
So let me answer to Shauna because she has two questions first, and then I'll take other questions. Rosin Kadeem?
That's fine, absolutely fine, Rajarshi.
So, Shauna, see, the question of the Tarjuma al-Quran. So, to address your question briefly is that, the first volume of the Tarjuma al-Quran, which is his commentary on the Surah Al-Fatiha, is of course very popular. But the other volumes were very controversial. And if you will just look up this volume titled the Sirat-e-Mustaqim, it was first published in Pakistan by Kamaristan Khan, but there's also an Indian reprint from the Khuda Bakhsh Library in Patna. What they do is they have collated all the reviews and exchanges that Azad had over the in course of the controversy over the Tarjuma al-Quran. So, if you will notice that in the Surah Al-Fatiha, Azad does not address the question of Nubuwwat. And as he gets into the other volumes, he's talking about how all other religions, major world religions, including Hinduism and others, were originally monotheistic religions. And then again, and so what he's trying to do is, in the second volume, to bring about an equivalence between world religions, right? And there again, he's not addressing the question of nubuwwat or prophethood. So immediately there was a lot of controversy, and very distinguished Maulana said ki, since you're talking about a question of equivalence without mentioning Muhammad's status as the last, as the seal of prophethood, as the last prophet, you're basically saying that anybody practicing any religion sincerely can get salvation. Right? So if you're just believing in Tawheed or the oneness of God, if that is sufficient for salvation, then there's nothing unique left about Islam. Right? So Azad said that, well, I'm going to take up the question of Nubuwwat in the later volumes, but if you will notice that the commentary is not a finished project. So he never kept his promise of addressing adequately. He did in the next volumes address the question of Nubuwwat, but not adequately. And it is an unfinished project. So I think just like I cannot, come to a conclusion that would make Pathoda happy, Azad, I guess, also couldn't come to a conclusion that would have made his cohorts happy. So, but that is a different site of operation. See, the whole question of Darul Islam and Darul Harb, etc., is a Hanafi law question. And I'm trying to locate Azad in the tradition of those questions, because it is only in terms of his jurisprudential practice that he's operating within the parameters of Hanafi law. So when he's writing his tafsir, he's not writing within the parameters of Hanafi jurisprudence. Right? He's writing in terms of theology. Right? It's a different discipline that he is operating in. It doesn't matter what kind of sources he's bringing in, Radhakrishnan, he's bringing in Lao Tse, he's bringing in Confucius. It doesn't matter what sources yet he's tapping into, but the fact is that he is operating in a different religious discipline of Islam when he is writing the tafsir. And even the tafsir is very controversial. Beyond the first volume, everybody reads the Quran, the commentary on the Surah Al-Fatiha, but I have doubt how many people would, for religious purposes, read the other volumes. You can actually see Kamaristan Khan's book for more details. So, Azad was, of course, was meeting with all kinds of people, and it is really very interesting if you look at the files that we still have in the West Bengal State Archives. That even as a teenager, he was like 14 or 15, and he was being reported by the police. So he's having meeting so he founded the Dar al-Irshad, and the police was taking notes of what he was saying. He might be addressing a small assembly of 10, 15 people, and the police were diligently taking notes. And it's the file itself is a massive document. It is incredible the amount of police reports that you have on him. And in fact, you have more reports on Azad than you would have on Subhash Bose himself in Calcutta. So in the Calcutta archives, there could be other reports elsewhere. So he was actually hanging out with all kinds of people, but towards the end of his life, his becoming, what his biographers say, that he was becoming a bit of a loner. So, but even still, some of the vital connections remain. So you will find in his book of letters that these odd Kachi Memon people still writing to him for guidance of how to perform the namaz, how to do the zikr, and he is still diligently, in the last years of his life, diligently advising them on how to do about this. So what Azad was, of course, from a very staunch Sunni family, but he was, if you will look at his autobiography, he's himself saying that he was aghast with the sectarianism that characterized his father's religious practice. And Calcutta at that point was a very cosmopolitan city, and he was hanging out with the Shia people. He was hanging out with the Kachi Memons, who were Sunnis but from different ethnicities. He was hanging out with Bengalis because the whole revolutionary underground that he briefly joined was essentially manned by Bengali Hindu revolutionaries, right? So he was close to Bomkesh Mustafis and others. He was very close to Syed Das, and they spent a lot of time in the jail together. So he was actually at one point of his time actually going out of way to meet up with people. But I guess over the years that changed, but some vital relationships remain still. So, and decolonization. So, see, after the death of Shibli, Azad's relationship with the Darul Musannafin got snapped, and Sulaiman Nadvi was very pissed off with him. But when decolonization happened and Sulaiman Nadvi left for Pakistan, it was Azad who rescued the Darul Musannafin. The fact that we still have the Darul Musannafin in Azamgarh, let's give the devil the credit. The credit goes to Azad. He got the money, he made these endowments. And if you will, I think it is, if you really want to see that, if you really want to see the range of engagements that Azad was doing as a minister after decolonization, so he was corresponding with the Aurobindo ashram, encouraging them to set up universities named after Aurobindo, hands-on with Jadavpur University, and of course the Indian Council of Cultural Relations. Which was his pet project, and it was really characterized by a very cosmopolitan outlook of how India could reach out to the wider world of Asia. And people say, and to finish this comment, because it's getting longer now, that people always remark that Jinnah was always so nasty to him, but when he was in Pakistan, he did make a point to go to his grave and say his Fatiha and so on. Even Pakistanis say that, well, this is the measure of the man. Manan might differ, but that this is that Jinnah didn't say Fatihas for other people, but Azad did. But it's really, if you look at, and now his papers are in the National Archives in Delhi. So if you see the range of engagements that he was doing, he was building up the Sangeet Natak Academy, the Shahid Academy, hands-on with Auroville in Pondicherry. He was writing notes in Urdu, and then Humayun Kabir was scribbling in English. He was getting into textbooks, even at the state level. It is incredible the amount of work they were doing in those decades. Apart from, of course, the big projects like the Indian Council of Cultural Relations.
So shall we move to the next question then, Rajarshi? And then after that also take Manubidis at the same time? Is that all right? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello everyone. Could you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
I'm joining from Bangladesh. I'm an assistant professor of history in Asian University for Women based in Chittagong. Perhaps I met Rajarshi in Mexico or somewhere else. Thank you so much, Rajarshi, for your wonderful paper. Actually, I have learned a lot about Azad from your paper. What I was wondering that the Azad's contribution to the development of Islamic law in South Asia, particularly his approach to the interpretation of Islamic law. If you talk about decolonization through Islamic law, I think the 1939 Act, when the MMA was passed in British India, it was the beginning of decolonization from the colonial administration of Islamic law in South Asia. But you also may notice that there was minimal role of Maulana Azad in that movement and in that process of legal reform in South Asia. So when we when we consider Azad's contribution to the development of Islamic law in broader South Asian context, I'm not familiar with his writing, but I want to know more from you that how can we evaluate or how can we put him in the broader South Asian context where Islamic law is reframed and remade in both colonial and post-colonial South Asia, including Pakistan and India, especially his position in that legal process. And I have a quick comment, if you allow me, that I feel that, compartmentalization of a scholar as Hanafi or Shafi is a bit problematic. And because if we again go back to 1939, that you see that there was a consensus and a Muslim scholars actually broke that barrier that we are Hanafi, we are Shafi, we are Maliki. So that consensus actually, I think it did not follow it in that way properly, but it was the beginning of beginning of that movement that we should not divide. Rather, we call it Islamic law, not the Hanafi Islamic law or Shafi Islamic law or Shia Islamic law.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Manobidi had a question. Let her just add it to this, Rajarshi. Manobidi?
Yes.
Yeah.
Rajarshi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Rajarshi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. And as an outsider, I'm asking a question, which I am not sure how relevant that is. And this is for, you have focused on his interpretations of Islamic law, and understandably, these interpretations pertain to intra-community, positions, approaches, and all that. But you have also talked about his secularist position, which pertains to inter-community relations. So when with the change in political regime, he is saying that mosques are not political sites. Now, can we not argue that the political project also should change, because the ruling regime has a mandate to be secular and inclusive, but it is not actually, it has not actualized that mandate. So there would be a political project to advocate that kind of actualization of an inclusive secular Indian nationalism. So why wouldn't still there be a political project, a demand of inclusiveness, where non-Hindus, all kinds of religious communities, will get equal consideration from the constitutions and parliament?
Manavati, I just missed the last part of your question, that we since secularism as a project had not actualized in post-colonial India, we needed to have a political movement to do so.
And the mosque could also have that political project. So if it was a political site to advocate a political campaign against a colonial unjust government, then after decolonization, there is a ruling regime which is still not actualized the mandate of inclusive secularism. So then the mosque also have a different kind of political project. I mean, the nature of political demand may change, but Mani, that was my question.
So, you have just this question, Manavati, or another?
No.
This question. Okay.
This is.
Okay, so I will speak to Professor Rahman's question first. So, see, as I explained in earlier comment, this paper is mostly focused on the juristic opinion the fatwa that Azad issued. Like I didn't talk about his tafsir in the paper. So, as I said, that Azad, even as a teenager, was quite warm to the Ahl Hadith movement, and even since he grew up in Amratola, Chitpur, and there were many Shia people there, he always, except one exception of having a conflict with the Shia community, he had very good relationships with them. And, in his speeches, he would try to reach out not just to Hindus or Christians, but also to Muslims of other sects, not the Shia or the Hadith. So, and if you will look at his tafsir, the tafsir actually evidences this characteristic of Azad's approach to community questions. But when he was writing his fatwa, except in one or two instances, fatwa has a technical, the fatwa is very technical, right? So as technical, as far as the technical parameter is concerned, Azad was operating within the parameters of Hanafi law. It is interesting that you referred to the 1931 Act. So, and I believe you have Ashraf Ali Thanvi's decision to exercise Talfiq and use the and draw on Shafi tradition on the question of khula and marital disputes. That is, of course, a very important moment. And you rightly pointed out that Azad was not part of this movement to bring about a legislative change in Islamic law. So, as I pointed out, Azad's practice as a mufti, Azad was always unattached. So even he was operating, in his practice of Islamic law, he was not encourage people to disengage with the state and its judiciary. So he was actually pushing for a judicial apathy. Like you still have the Amirat-e Sharia in Patna, which is a body of, which is an independent body, independent of the state, of the ulama, who offer legal advice to Muslim litigants. And their mandate is to encourage Muslims to not take intra-community disputes to the colonial or the post-colonial courts, right? So I don't know about Bangladesh, but in India still, you have many branches of the Imarat-e Sharia operating. And Justin, if he's still here, is an expert on the Imarat-e Sharia. So Azad was actually very active in the formation of the Imarat-e Sharia, and in his practice of Islamic law, he did not at all engage with the colonial legislative process, and in fact encourage people to disengage with colonial state, the courts, and not bring intra-community disputes to the court. Azad was, of course, but Azad was, Talfiq, the instrument, the legal instrument that Ashraf Ali Thanvi used, is said to be derived from either Abdul Wahab Sharani from Egypt or Shah Waliullah in South Asia. There is a dispute among scholars, and I have no credentials to solve the dispute. So Azad, of course, knew about it, because Azad considered himself to be intellectually very much within the tradition of Shah Waliullah, but like many other scholars, people from within Shah Waliullah's movement, such as the Deoband Seminary, they preferred to practice Hanafi law. Like the Deoband Seminary, as a matter of principle, practices Hanafi law. So all the Deobandi madrasas across the subcontinent still practice Hanafi law. But if you will go to Rewari Tanao in Banaras, in the Ahl Hadith University, they practice Ahl Hadith law. So the distinctions are not really that dissolved yet. If you will just look at the polemics that are happening all around us all the time. So, Manavidi, that's a verb. That is, I think, a very. I'll take your question as a comment, Manavidi. It is, I think, a good way to complicate. It is not really. It does not really negate what I've been trying to say, but actually is trying to deepen what I'm saying. So I'll take that as a comment, Manavidi. Thank you to both of you.
So are there any more questions? I can't see any, but am I missing any? Rajarshi, can you see any questions anywhere? The chat is not showing anything, certainly. Right, so do you see anything? No? Okay, so in that case, I'll sign off as host of the meeting today. I think it's been a good session. We've had a slight interruption with technology, but otherwise